Urban combat strips away all your advantages. In the open desert, you can see a threat from 3 clicks out. In a city, your horizon is the building 10 feet in front of your face. Every window is a potential sniper hide. Every pile of garbage is a suspected IED. The smell is what gets you first. A wretched, suffocating mix of raw sewage, rotting garbage, and pulverized concrete that coats the back of your throat like chalk. That is the aroma of a city that is actively trying to kill you. It was late July, and the heat index was pushing 115 degrees. Our squad, call sign Outlaw 24, drew the short straw for a route clearance mission in the Market District. The briefing was standard issue. Clear a 2-mile stretch of a major arterial road so a vulnerable supply convoy could push through to a forward operating base. Command assured us the sector had been pacified 2 weeks prior. Just a mop-up operation, they said. But anyone who has spent time kicking indoors knows that pacified is just a fancy word for an enemy that is waiting for you to look the other way. I was the point man, walking a few paces ahead of Staff Sergeant Reyes, our squad leader, and our radio man, Glitch Patterson. We dismounted our striker-armored vehicles at the edge of the district. The heavy steel ramps dropped, and the brutal midday sun physically slammed into us. Carrying 80 pounds of body armor, extra magazines, breaching tools, and hydration packs, we felt like we were marching inside a blast furnace. As we pushed into the narrow, winding labyrinth of the old market, the strikers couldn't follow. The streets were too narrow, the corners too sharp. We were officially dismounted, entering the belly of the beast without heavy support. The atmosphere in the market was suffocating. Usually, even in a war zone, a city has a pulse. You hear the distant hum of generators, wild dogs barking, the muffled murmur of people hiding behind closed doors. But here, nothing. The stalls were completely abandoned, their corrugated metal roofs creaking in the hot, stagnant breeze. The silence was absolute and deeply unsettling. It was the kind of creeping dread that preys on your nerves, making you jump at the sound of your own boots crunching on broken glass. Every shadow looked like a rifle barrel. Every rooftop felt like it was staring back at us. Reyes kept us moving, maintaining our spacing, checking our corners in a fluid, synchronized dance of urban survival. We were 3 blocks deep when I felt the first real, chilling spike of adrenaline. It wasn't a gunshot, it was a detail. Urban warfare makes you hyper-observant. You memorize the baseline of your environment so you can spot the anomalies. As I sliced the pie on a blind intersection, my rifle tucked tight into my shoulder, I noticed the alleyway we were supposed to take to bypass the main square. It was gone. Not bombed out, bricked up. The thick mortar between the cinder blocks was still wet, sweating dark moisture in the baking heat. Someone had recently and deliberately altered the map of the city. I raised a closed fist, halting the squad instantly, and signaled Reyes to move up. He looked at the wet mortar, his jaw tightening beneath his helmet. In a split second, the grim tactical reality washed over us. The enemy wasn't hiding from us, they were herding us. By walling off the bypass, they had forced us down a single narrow corridor flanked by 3-story concrete apartments with barred windows, a textbook fatal funnel. Glitch reached back to key his radio to call higher command, but before his thumb could press the transmit button, a single hollow metallic thud echoed from the rooftop directly to our left. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy fragmentation grenade landing perfectly on the dirt street, rolling to a stop right between my boots. Time doesn't slow down in combat. Your brain just shifts into a terrifying overdrive. You process every microsecond. I saw the rusted safety spoon resting in the dirt next to the ribbed steel body of the grenade. "Frag!" I roared, the word tearing out of my throat as I punted the lethal little sphere down the alley with the toe of my boot. I didn't wait to see where it went. I threw my entire weight backward, tackling Glitch onto the hard-packed dirt and covering the back of my neck with both hands. The detonation was deafening. In the confined space of the alleyway, the concussive wave didn't just wash over us. It physically picked us up and slammed us back down against the earth. A thick, choking cloud of pulverized brick, raw sewage, and gray dust instantly swallowed the street. My ears were ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine that drowned out everything else, but I didn't need my hearing to know what was coming next. The trap had just snapped shut. Before the dust could even begin to settle, the air was ripped apart by the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a PKM machine gun. Tracers cut through the smoke like angry red lasers, chewing the concrete facades into jagged, flying shrapnel. The enemy was firing from elevated positions, second and third-story windows, deeply recessed in the shadows to hide their muzzle flashes. It was a textbook L-shaped ambush, and we were trapped dead center at the elbow. "Get off the X! Move, move, move!" Staff Sergeant Reyes bellowed, his voice barely cutting through the deafening roar of automatic weapons fire. The street was rapidly turning into a meat grinder. Rounds snapped and cracked mere inches from our helmets, that distinct, terrifying sound of supersonic lead breaking the sound barrier right next to your ear. Training took over where conscious thought failed. I rolled onto my stomach, brought my M4 up, and started putting suppressive fire into the dark rectangular voids of the upper windows. I couldn't see individual targets, just the fleeting shadows where the heavy fire was originating. "Bound to the courtyard, right side," Reyes yelled, pointing through the haze to a partially collapsed stone wall attached to a shelled-out bakery about 20 yards ahead. It was terrible cover, but out here in the open street, we were sitting ducks waiting to be eliminated. "Covering!" yelled our saw gunner Miller. He aggressively planted his bipod in the dirt and let loose a deafening continuous burst, walking a line of heavy 5.56 rounds across the second-story balconies to keep the enemy's heads down. Under his covering fire, we moved. We bounded in pairs, the heavy thud of our boots syncing with our racing heartbeats. You feel impossibly heavy and exposed during a dead sprint in full kit. Every single step expects the brutal impact of a round. I slid violently behind the crumbling stone wall, my lungs burning, sucking in air thick with the metallic, acidic taste of cordite. One by one, the rest of the squad piled in behind the inadequate cover, dragging Miller in last. The air directly above our heads was literally buzzing with incoming fire, chewing the top of our stone wall down inch by brutal inch. The noise was a physical weight, pressing in from all sides. "Status!" Reyes barked, doing a rapid, aggressive visual check of the squad. Miraculously, everyone was still breathing and in the fight, but we were pinned incredibly tight. If we stayed here, we were going to be neutralized by attrition. "Glitch, get higher on the horn. We need QRF and we need heavy armor down this street 5 minutes ago." Glitch, our radio man, was furiously working the handset of his man-pack radio. His face was pale beneath the mask of sweat and street grime. He swapped batteries, checked the antenna connections, and keyed the handset again, shouting our call sign into the mic. Nothing but frantic, heavy static. He looked up at Reyes, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. "Sergeant, they're jamming us!" It wasn't just a physical ambush, it was an electronic one. The enemy had systematically isolated us from command. We were completely cut off, blind and deaf to the outside world. And just as the grim reality of our isolation settled into the pit of my stomach, a new, terrifyingly familiar sound echoed from the far end of the walled-off street, the heavy mechanical squeal and grinding of tank tracks. But it wasn't our armor. The sound of squealing metal and diesel clatter vibrated through the soles of our boots. You don't just hear heavy armor, you feel it in your teeth. In the claustrophobic confines of an urban street, a tracked vehicle is an absolute nightmare. The enemy didn't have Abrams tanks, but they had captured hardware. Through the settling dust of the grenade blast, a massive, angular shadow lurched around the far corner of the alley. It was a BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle, likely stripped from a fallen local garrison, its battered green hull draped in rusted scrap metal for improvised armor. The thick black diesel exhaust plumed into the stagnant air, choking us with the smell of burning oil and impending doom. "Armor! Front!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking against the roar of the engine. Our stone wall, which had barely been adequate against small arms fire, was suddenly as useless as wet cardboard. The BMP didn't even bother to come to a halt. Its turret whirred, the hydraulic motors grinding audibly over the din of battle, and the heavy main gun swung directly toward our position. But it wasn't the main cannon that fired first, it was the coaxial machine gun. A merciless, uninterrupted stream of heavy-caliber rounds slammed into our crumbling barricade. The impact was geological. Chunks of masonry the size of cinder blocks exploded into deadly flying shrapnel. Dust choked our lungs, and the sheer concussive force of the impacts battered our helmets. We were entirely suppressed, pressed so hard into the dirt I felt like I was trying to merge my body with the earth itself. "Wall's failing. We can't stay here," I shouted to Reyes, spitting out a mouthful of grit. We had exactly one light anti-armor weapon, a single-shot AT-4 strapped to the back of our grenadier, Jenkins. But standing up to aim and fire it in this relentless hail of lead was guaranteed suicide. The enemy infantry in the upper windows had resumed their plunging fire, using the BMP's deafening assault as cover to adjust their angles. We were caught in a brutal crossfire, wedged tightly between the hammer of the rifles and the anvil of the armored vehicle. Reyes was already reading the fatal geometry of our situation. His eyes darted from the disintegrating wall to the boarded-up windows of the shelled-out bakery directly behind us. It was a blind push, but it was our only out. "We're displacing into the structure," Reyes roared, slapping my shoulder plate hard enough to bruise. "Fix bayonets if you have to, but we are going inside. Jenkins, prep the AT-4. Glitch and Miller, pop smoke. Throw everything you have." Adrenaline is a chemical fire that burns away exhaustion. Glitch and Miller ripped the pins from their M118 smoke grenades, hurling the green and white canisters over the wall into the courtyard between us and the bakery. Thick, billowing clouds erupted almost instantly, creating a temporary opaque wall against the enemy's line of sight. But smoke doesn't stop bullets, it only blinds the shooter. The incoming fire immediately shifted from targeted shots to blind, sweeping bursts that tore violently through the colored haze. "Go! Move!" Reyes commanded. We broke cover in pairs, diving into the blinding, choking smoke. The 20 yards to the bakery felt like a marathon sprint underwater. I hit the heavy wooden door of the building with my shoulder, expecting resistance, but the blast from an earlier mortar strike had compromised the frame. The wood splintered inward, and I spilled violently into the pitch-black interior, my rifle instantly coming up to scan the suffocating darkness. The air inside was freezing and smelled of damp rot and old copper. Miller and Glitch piled in right behind me, coughing violently as they cleared the fatal threshold. Then came Reyes, but as Jenkins crossed the entryway, the deafening, distinct crack of a high-velocity round punched through the chaos of the courtyard. Jenkins didn't cry out, he just folded, his forward momentum carrying him inside as he crashed hard onto the debris-littered floor, his heavy gear slamming against the concrete. His AT-4 clattered off into the darkness. Before I could even reach down to drag him clear of the doorway, the heavy iron door of the bakery's rear exit, our only potential way out to the next street, slammed shut with a massive metallic clang. A second later, the unmistakable sound of a heavy steel deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the dark room. We weren't just pinned down anymore. We were sealed inside. The darkness inside the bakery was absolute, a sudden blinding contrast to the punishing glare of the Iraqi sun. The air was incredibly thick, heavy with the taste of pulverized concrete and the sharp, unmistakable metallic scent of fresh blood. Outside, the BMP-1 unleashed another deafening volley from its coaxial machine gun, the heavy rounds chewing mercilessly into the thick adobe and brick facade of our temporary fortress. Every impact sent violent tremors through the floorboards, raining decades of dust and debris down onto our helmets. "Doc, get on Jenkins!" Sergeant Reyes's voice cut through the ringing in my ears, sharp and unyielding. I grabbed the heavy drag handle on the back of Jenkins' plate carrier and heaved backward, my boots slipping frantically on the rubble-strewn floor. I pulled him away from the fatal funnel of the splintered doorway and into the deeper shadows behind a massive, overturned industrial dough mixer. Doc Hayes was there in a heartbeat, his hands moving with practiced, frantic precision. He ripped open Jenkins' gear, his red lens headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the choking dust. "He took a round just below the collarbone, missed the plate," Doc shouted over the relentless mechanical roar outside. "I'm packing it, but he's out of the fight. We need an evac, Reyes." "There is no evac, Doc. Comms are still jammed," Glitch yelled back, slamming his fist against his useless radio handset. "We are completely blacked out." The reality of our situation settled over us like a suffocating lead blanket. The heat inside the unventilated bakery was already climbing, trapping the 115-degree ambient temperature and mixing it with the toxic exhaust fumes drifting in from the street. My mouth was dry as bone, my canteens were half empty, and the massive adrenaline dump was leaving my muscles trembling. We were perfectly boxed in. The rear heavy iron door was bolted from the outside, a deliberate anvil to the BMP's hammer. The enemy had intentionally funneled us into this specific building. It wasn't just cover, it was a reinforced tomb. Boom! The entire structure groaned in agony as a high explosive round from the BMP's 73mm main gun slammed into the exterior wall just above us. Daylight violently punched through the ceiling as a massive chunk of masonry collapsed, missing Miller by mere inches. "They're gonna bring the whole damn structure on our heads," Miller coughed, wiping a thick layer of plaster dust from his tactical goggles. "Ammo check. I'm down to 2 belts for the saw." "3 mags," I called out, my voice cracking from the dry, abrasive air. The rest of the squad echoed similar grim numbers. We'd burned through half our combat load just trying to survive the initial ambush in the street. If the enemy infantry pushed the building after the armor softened it up, we simply wouldn't have the firepower to hold the line. "We need to neutralize that armor right now," Reyes stated, his face an unreadable mask of grim determination in the red glow of Doc's light. "Where is the AT-4? I frantically scanned the debris-littered floor near the entryway. "Jenkins dropped it when he went down. It's in the rubble near the door." "I've got it," I volunteered, not waiting for an order. I low-crawled on my stomach, the jagged pieces of broken brick tearing at my uniform. The air near the door was a deadly horizontal storm of incoming lead, snapping just inches above my helmet. I blindly swept my hands through the dark, cutting my gloves on shattered glass until my fingers finally wrapped around the familiar, bulky fiberglass tube of the anti-armor weapon. I dragged it back to the mixer, my lungs burning with exertion. "Good," Reyes said, "but we can't fire this from the ground floor. The backblast in this enclosed space will turn our internal organs to jelly, and the angle is garbage. We need elevation. We need the roof." He pointed towards the back of the bakery, where a narrow, crumbling concrete staircase spiraled upward into the suffocating gloom of the second floor. "I'll take point," I said, slinging my rifle and gripping the AT-4 tightly. "Miller, keep that doorway suppressed. If they try to breach, give 'em hell." "You got it, brother." Miller racked his saw, his eyes locked on the splintered entrance. I moved towards the stairs, every instinct screaming that we were walking deeper into the trap. The stairs were narrow, choked with debris, and entirely blind. I took a deep breath of the foul, dusty air, raised my rifle with one hand, and took the first cautious step up. But as I rounded the landing, halfway to the second floor, a wooden floorboard creaked loudly right over my head. followed instantly by the terrifying, distinct sound of a metal pin being pulled from a grenade.
The metallic ping of the spoon flying off the grenade echoed in the tight concrete stairwell. There was no time to think, only react. I knew I couldn't outrun gravity, and turning my back meant the blast wave would catch me completely exposed. Instead, I threw myself flat against the heavy stone wall of the landing, curling into the tightest ball my ceramic body armor would allow, and opened my mouth to equalize the pressure in my eardrums. The fragmentation grenade bounced down the steps, a lethal steel egg, and detonated halfway down the flight. The enclosed space amplified the blast 100-fold. A shockwave of pure, invisible violence punched the breath straight from my lungs, and a blinding cloud of pulverized dust and jagged concrete shrapnel rained heavily down on my helmet. My ears screamed in high-pitched, agonizing whine that drowned out the entire war zone. Through the choking gray smoke, I knew the thrower would be moving in to finish the job, expecting to find nothing but casualties on the landing. Adrenaline, raw and unfiltered, flooded my system, overriding the pain. I didn't wait for the dust to clear. I pushed violently up off the floor, ignoring the sharp ache radiating from my ribs, and charged up the remaining steps. As I crested the second floor, a shadowy figure materialized through the haze, raising an AK-47. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, shocked that I was still moving. That hesitation cost him his life. I brought my M4 up, acquired his center mass through my optics, and squeezed the trigger twice. The sharp, controlled double tap echoed in the small room. The enemy fighter crumpled backward, neutralized instantly, his rifle clattering uselessly to the floorboards. "Clear!" I roared, my voice raw, coughing out a mouthful of plaster grit. Reyes was right behind me, his heavy boots pounding on the stairs. The second floor was a bombed-out apartment, its front wall completely sheared off by a previous airstrike. It offered a terrifyingly exposed, yet perfect vantage point overlooking the street below. Outside, the mechanical shrieking of the BMP-1 was deafening. It was slowly pivoting its turret, preparing to put another 73mm high-explosive round right into our ground floor position, where Doc was desperately trying to keep Jenkins alive. We had seconds before the bakery became a mass grave. "Do it! Take the shot!" Reyes yelled. He immediately stepped to the jagged edge of the wall and provided covering fire, his rifle barking as he suppressed the upper windows across the street to keep the enemy snipers off my back. I stepped up to the precipice. My hands were shaking, slick with sweat and dust, as I hoisted the heavy fiberglass tube of the AT-4 onto my right shoulder. I pulled the safety pin, flipped open the sights, and cocked the firing lever. The weapon felt unnaturally heavy. Below me, the BMP-1 looked like a massive, armored beast, its exhaust pipe belching thick black smoke. I lined up the crude iron sights with the thin, vulnerable side armor of the vehicle, just below the turret ring. "Backblast area clear!" Reyes screamed, stepping away from the rear of the tube. I took a half breath, held it, and pressed the firing button. The weapon roared. A massive plume of fire and smoke erupted from the back of the tube, violently shaking the entire floor. The 84mm anti-tank rocket tore through the air, leaving a blinding trail of white smoke, and crossed the street in a fraction of a second and slammed directly into the flank of the BMP. The impact was apocalyptic. A blinding flash of orange fire consumed the vehicle, followed instantly by a deafening, earth-shattering secondary explosion as the munitions inside the hull cooked off. A shockwave of blistering heat and twisted metal washed over our position, forcing us to duck hard behind the crumbling masonry. The armored threat was neutralized, its burning wreckage casting a hellish, flickering glow over the fatal funnel. But our victory was brutally short-lived. The massive explosion had blown out the walled-up section of the alleyway, creating a potential exit, but it also acted as a dinner bell. Over the crackling flames of the destroyed BMP, a new, chilling sound rose up, the coordinated, overlapping shouts of dozens of enemy fighters surging into the street from the surrounding blocks. They were swarming us. Downstairs, Miller's saw suddenly roared to life in a continuous, desperate, cyclic burn. The ground floor was being breached. We were out of anti-armor rockets, down to our last few magazines, and now the entire district was coming to finish the job. The cyclic roar of Miller's saw downstairs wasn't just suppressing fire.
It was a desperate, unbroken scream of pure survival. Reyes and I didn't exchange a single word. We just moved. We bounded back down the crumbling, dust-choked stairwell, slipping on the debris and the shattered masonry. The ground floor of the bakery was practically unrecognizable. The blast from the BMP had blown out the front wall, filling the room with a hellish, flickering orange light and the suffocating, toxic black smoke of burning diesel and cooking ammunition. Miller was braced behind the shattered remnants of the doorframe, the barrel of his saw glowing a dull, angry cherry red in the gloom. He was pouring heavy, sustained bursts into the street, holding back a tidal wave of insurgents trying to push through the smoke. Behind the overturned industrial mixer, Doc Hayes had Jenkins hoisted onto his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Jenkins was pale, his gear soaked darkly, but he was still conscious. "The explosion blew the barricade," Reyes roared over the deafening cacophony of incoming fire. He pointed through the massive hole where the front of the bakery used to be. The destroyed armored vehicle had taken a massive chunk of the bricked-up alleyway with it when its munitions cooked off. It was a jagged, smoking breach leading to the adjacent street. It was a terrifyingly narrow window of opportunity. "That's our exit. We bound on my mark. Glitch, take point. I've got rear security." We formed a tight, protective diamond around Doc and Jenkins. Adrenaline pushed the exhaustion out of my muscles, replacing it with a singular primal focus. I slammed a fresh magazine into my M4, the metallic click feeling reassuringly heavy in my sweat-slicked palms. "Mark!" Reyes bellowed. We surged out of the bakery and into the inferno. The heat radiating off the burning BMP was physically agonizing, singeing the hair on my exposed arms. As we pushed through the jagged breach in the brick wall, the air was saturated with the sharp, acidic tang of high explosives and raw sewage. Tracers snapped past us, cracking like bullwhips, but the thick, oily smoke from the destroyed armor masked our movement just enough. I fired on the move, putting controlled pairs into the shadowy figures shifting in the upper windows, my vision narrowing to nothing but the front sight post of my rifle. We stumbled through the rubble and spilled into the adjacent wider street, gasping for air that wasn't choked with smoke. And then a miracle happened. The heavy, oppressive blanket of static on Glitch's radio suddenly shattered. The localized jamming field couldn't penetrate the dense concrete blocks separating us from the ambush site. Through the hiss and crackle, a clear, authoritative voice punched through. "Outlaw 2-4, this is Warlord 6. We have your smoke. Hard entry in 10 seconds. Keep your heads down." The ground beneath our boots began to vibrate, a deep, rhythmic tremor that was entirely different from the enemy's hardware. The heavy, roaring diesel engines of 2 Stryker armored vehicles tore around the far corner of the avenue. They didn't slow down. Their remote weapon stations instantly tracked the rooftops, and the deafening thunder of twin 50-caliber machine guns tore the sky apart. The heavy rounds systematically dismantled the enemy positions, turning the concrete facades into pulverized dust and completely suppressing the threat. The lead Stryker slammed its brakes, screeching to a halt right in front of us, and the heavy steel ramp dropped. We didn't climb inside, we practically collapsed into the armored belly of the beast. Doc dragged Jenkins in first, followed by Miller, Glitch, me, and finally Reyes. As the hydraulic ramp whined and slammed shut, sealing us in the air-conditioned, dimly lit troop compartment, the immediate roar of the battle outside was instantly muffled. We were out. No one cheered. No one spoke. The silence inside that Stryker was as heavy as the silence we had felt walking into the market. I leaned my head back against the cold steel hull, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't unclip my helmet strap. The adrenaline dump was catastrophic, leaving me hollow, freezing, and nauseous. I looked across the aisle at Reyes. He was staring at the floor, his face coated in a thick paste of sweat and gray dust, his chest heaving. Doc was already hanging an IV bag for Jenkins, whose eyes were finally open and tracking. We survived the fatal funnel. We brought our brothers home. But as I closed my eyes, all I could see were those bricked-up walls, and all I could smell was the wretched, suffocating dust of a city that had tried to bury us alive. That is the true weight of combat. You might physically escape the kill zone, but a part of your mind never really leaves it.